I'm cautiously optimistic that it will start to make its way into the practice of investing much faster. But cautiously optimistic because I also think we don't have as much time as we thought we did. So that behavioral change about how investment happens has to happen faster. And the public dollars, need to be used more efficiently.
Welcome to the New Enlightenment podcast from Adam Smith's Panmure House. I'm Adam Dixon. Today, I'm joined by Stacy Swann. Stacy is founder of Resilient Earth Capital and formerly Chief Executive Officer of Climate Finance Advisors. Stacy previously established and was head of the International Finance Corporation Blended Finance Department and has also held senior and executive positions with the U.S. Department of Treasury. Stacy, welcome to the New Enlightenment.
Thanks for having me, Adam. Pleasure to be here.
Let's talk about COP. COP 29. We're already at 29. Next year, it's going to be COP 30 in Brazil. The COP just happened in Baku. And so in the media, it's what is climate finance? And I think there's a lot of people that are asking themselves, what happened in Baku? Was it a success? Was it a failure? What is climate finance? Maybe just start there. What is climate finance? What do we need to understand about what's going on?
Yeah, so we can certainly talk about COP, this year's COP and past COPs, and we might get to touch on some of them over the course of our conversation. But climate finance, that as a term, has also evolved in its meaning over the many years that we've been having COPs, right? It used to be that climate finance was defined very specifically and very narrowly around the specific amounts of development aid that were given for climate-related purposes, investments, through the multilateral system, potentially also bilaterally from certain developed country governments. And that was a very narrow way to define what quote unquote climate finance was. Call it 20 years ago, right? So climate finance, as it was originally articulated by the international development community, was very specifically about that incremental additional development aid, something called ODA, that governments were giving to countries to help with their climate agenda. It has evolved over the years, and it's partly evolved over the years, it being the definition. It's partly evolved over the years because public balance sheets are insufficient to address the climate crisis. And these development dollars, or these government dollars used for development aid tagged for climate, needed to be leveraged. So if you go back to, call it 2007, 2008, 2009, the definition of climate finance started becoming a little bit more blurry. And coincidentally, this was also at the same time that blended finance was starting to take off as an idea. Just to take an aside, blended finance is not really new. Blended finance is really, how do you take public or patient sources of capital and use those patient sources of capital to catalyze private investment? It's the best way I like to think about it is it's like a math equation. A plus B equals C. Blended is the C. It's the outcome. It's not actually A or B. A is usually dollars from the public balance sheet, incentives that the public balance sheet wants to give to accelerate investment in certain sectors or certain areas. It's been something that, governments have been doing since the Industrial Revolution. And B are the private capital that come in alongside. And the nature of A usually is that it can share different risks, and it might also be cheaper. And to the extent that that's true, it can catalyze a lot of private capital, because what does private capital enjoy? It enjoys understanding that its returns are a little bit less volatile than otherwise, predictable. And also they like it when other people share those risks, because that means that they also share the downside if losses are incurred. So you put A plus B together, and that's what blended finance is. Around 2007, 2008, what you started to see was that public balance sheets, partly because of the financial crisis in 2008, the public balance sheets were getting ever more constrained. It was also tax cuts. It was also the rise of different types of development impacts that were everyone recognized were needed to be funded, like climate, but other things. And the observation that blending public donor money with private capital is actually something that can provide more capital for that impact agenda than would otherwise be there. Climate change was in the multilateral system. So the World Bank, the MDBs, even some development finance institutions was at the top of the list of impact areas that were at the front line of what was happening around blended finance. What that did is it kind of blurred that line of what climate finance was. Climate finance as a definition started out, call it in the late 90s, 2000s, as a very narrow understanding of development aid tagged for climate. But by 2010, was very much starting to become a little bit fuzzier, and it's starting to be essentially mean kind of more than just those development dollars, those public dollars. So I'll pause there.
Yeah. So I've got a few remarks or a few questions. I mean, I'm glad you mentioned that blended finance, and I do want to come back to blended finance later. But I'm glad that you mentioned that blended finance has been around. It's not this new thing. And often when we hear blended finance, people think, oh, it's multilateral development banks or national development banks that are supporting private capital to create this kind of private market system. And you think, actually, this is what the World Bank was set up to do, and it's what government
Absolutely.
is doing again for generations, right? So I think it's probably very fundamental to market based development. Has been for generations. So I'm glad that you mentioned that, because again, we tend to look at things as being novel when actually they're not very novel.
They're not very novel.
I think that's a really good point. I'm glad that you mentioned that. The question I have about climate finance now is this: you mentioned that it was specifically the beginning targeted toward driving capital to investments that address a climate issue. And whether that's infrastructure, I would assume, or power generation in particular, or transport systems. Now it's been stretched where adaptation often looks like sound infrastructure investment that we would see in normal overseas development assistance. And loss and damage now, which is the other category, again seems like, development dollars as we would have thought of them before, but now all in this realm of climate finance. And my question, or perhaps concern, and I'm interested to see what you think about this, is climate change is frequently conflated with everything now, right?
Sure.
And all problems and challenges have a climate angle. And that's not to say that climate change doesn't affect development, doesn't affect, so many of our economic and natural systems. That's not my point. But it's conflated in a way where the problems we want to address are other than climate change, but we're using climate change to drive dollars to other challenges, right? Building sound infrastructure in emerging markets, for example. My worry, though, is what is the risk of some of those dollars going into areas that don't actually address climate change? I mean, when we think of climate change as being, CO2 in the atmosphere and methane emissions, right? The greenhouse gases, as we call it. What if it's driven into areas that really aren't about climate? How do we know then that it's actually climate finance?
It's a great question. And I think the fact that it's become a bit more fuzzy around the edges in terms of its definition doesn't help answer the question. But let me try and kind of walk through kind of what has happened with the definition to answer your question over what's happened with the definition over the course of the last 15 years. So, roughly around 2010, 2012, this idea that you would take some public capital and catalyze private investment for different types of impact areas really took hold. And the drivers for that are many. One was the financial crisis of 2008, but the other was that the development finance institutions, IFC being one of them, were starting to put into practice the concept of taking these public dollars and structuring them in private investments more systematically than had previously been done. prior to kind of roughly the end of the 2000 knots, most of the work that was being done either with climate finance designated funds through MDBs or with catalyzing private sector was done in the public sector arms of these institutions. So, for example, the World Bank's public sector arm, IBRD, would give money to a country to do X infrastructure project, which had private investment, but the money came through the public side of both the institution of the World Bank, but also the government to set up the infrastructure. And by 2010, 2012, there was more practice among IFC, EBRD, Asia Development Bank, even some of the DFIs, where they were taking those funds and doing private sector investment, not through the public side of it. And that's pretty important because another pretty important nuance of development finance, ODA finance, and the patient parts of those dollars, many of which were climate finance tagged. If you are giving patient capital through the World Bank or through the public sector arm of an MDB, usually the concessionality is set. You're not allowed to, it's not that you're not allowed to, the practice is not to kind of structure to meet the financing gap, but rather to give plain vanilla loans at 25 basis points for 40 years. The concessionality of that benefits the government, and the government does what they will with those dollars. If you are taking the same patient capital and structuring it into private investment, you have the ability to kind of minimize the concessionality to only what the market needs to get the project going. And
Right.
that practice is both kind of beneficial for the leverage of private capital, but it also means that the public dollars can maybe get more returns because they're priced closer to market than closer to zero.
Okay, so I just want to, so for listeners that don't know what concessionality means, so basically just to say that concessionality is, there's the market price that you would charge someone for a loan. The concessionality is effectively the discount that you would take off of that because you want to give them a cheaper deal, because that's where the development comes in.
And you want to incentivize, right?
Incentivize, right? But but what you're saying is effectively the shift towards through the public sector arm, that concessionality is kind of picked out of the air and sort of decided on this. Whereas then with the private sector, it's like, wait a minute, we have enough information to get a better return for the taxpayer, if you like, because we're looking more at market dynamics. Is that how it worked?
Would never say picked out of the air, and nor would any of our public sector colleagues from those development finance institutions. No, the concessionality from a public sector lending perspective, you're absolutely right to kind of identify the market rate and zero as your kind of area to play. But the concessionality on public sector is usually a price just above zero. That price is for, it's usually set, different MDBs have different practices, but it's usually set by some conversation with government borrowers of the global south who are receiving money from those institutions. Oftentimes it's 25 basis points over, above kind of market, above LIBOR or SOFR at this point. And it is set that way for periods of time. So the next 6 months, 12 months, 2 years, we are going to be giving our public capital this price. And the concessionality is this price, is the difference between this price and market. Now, remember, in a lot of these countries, interest rates are really volatile. Sovereign ratings are high for a lot of these countries. That is usually the floor for private investment spreads, not the limit. So a 25 basis points for an example, for a 25 basis points public sector loan is pretty attractive in a place where you might have 10, 15, 20% interest rates. So that's the concessionality of public lending in the development finance world. And it hasn't really changed much over, the 25 years that climate
Plain,
finance.
the plain vanilla development finance world, you mean?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. And I
Yes.
didn't mean to denigrate those that are, more an exception picking out of the air. I know there's a lot of kind of work that goes on, even political negotiations that goes
That's and
on.
that's really the point. I mean, that it's not in a vacuum. It does sit in a context of macroeconomic issues. The IMF is usually involved. But it is very much kind of close to zero as a intended kind of way that the public lending is supporting economic growth, right?
In the shift to through DFI or the development finance corporations to get private sector, and that's where the private market logics come into the provision, right? That's and how novel would you say that is? Because in some in the kind of critical academic sphere would call that the Wall Street consensus, where he moved into this very market driven development form. How accurate is that, or how where's the novelty, as it were, in this?
So the principle behind starting at market and working backwards to price in the concessionality for blended finance for climate for private investment, starts with your economists who don't like market distortion, right? If you over subsidize something, give it more than what it needs to kind of actually happen, then you could prevent disincentives for growth and competition and things like that. So the principles for deploying these types of concessional capital and blended finance structures, again, started with climate change in the DFI world in the 2000s and post 2010. Really started with thinking, what's the market rate? How can I work backwards, price discover what it is to get that investment financially closed? It's market discovery as much as anything else. And that is a benefit worth providing or an incentive worth providing. But if you incentivize too much or you kind of over subsidize, then you might distort the market. So that's the principle behind kind of pricing it from market backwards as opposed to from zero upwards.
Right.
The other kind of principles around, deploying blended finance that were developed roughly in the same time period, one is consistent with many of the development finance institutions' concepts of additionality, right? Their money or this climate finance money blended this way shouldn't crowd out other sources of capital, right? So that's an important one. The concept that it leads to sustainability is one that's not just about environmental or economic sustainability, but also that whatever you're investing in with the private sector can be commercially viable at some point. So you are giving kind of an implied subsidy because you're giving a discount on the term or the tenor or you're going subordinated or whatever you're using in your basket of levers to provide that concessionality, but that this demonstrates to the market that X can happen and future investments of a similar nature could actually be more commercially viable with less incentives. And then, obviously, because, the sources of blended finance for climate change, sources of concessional capital for climate change that were blended were public dollars. This goes back to our kind of initial discussion of what climate finance is, but they all started as public ODA or additional money like ODA dollars. They needed to be fully transparent. In a number of countries, there's a little bit of a concern that funding private investment or the private sector actually can lead to a lot of shenanigans. So running these funds through development finance institutions, doing it to catalyze private investment also came along with these principles of, having full transparency around them, how it was used and what structures for how long to what counterparties, that kind of thing.
So, I want to come back to climate finance, but because we're on the topic of blended finance, and I would say you were one of the pioneers, if you like, of the field, having set up the department at the International Finance Corporation, which, for listeners that don't know, the IFC is the private sector arm of the World Bank. And so you're already in a private sector kind of context through the IFC, but then you're doing How is it? I guess the question is, how do you set up a blended finance department in something that by default is blended finance? Isn't it kind of setting up the IFC within the IFC, or what's the difference? And then tell us a bit more about that experience and context.
Yeah, what a great question. And I can understand why people from the outside might perceive it to be kind of, oh, IFC should be doing this on their own balance sheet. Right. So, first of all, if you ask IFC and the investment officers on IFC and the board, the management, and then the board of IFC, which is the board of the World Bank, they will acknowledge that their role is to provide investment to catalyze private investment in emerging markets. But they like to do that on as commercial as possible terms for their financing. What they bring along with their financing are additional, let's call it attributes of getting money from an institution like the IFC, which are very high performance standards on environment, social, and governance issues, very deep diligence around know your client and integrity and things like that for the counterparties. And IFC, as part of the World Bank Group, brings a bit of a halo effect to emerging markets in terms of its ability to, withstand downturns of, those economies if things go poorly. Just by virtue of who IFC is and what it has in terms of the, additional bells and whistles around its diligence and attributes. Just by virtue of that, investors like to invest alongside and with IFC. Period. However, back in the day, 25 years ago, climate in particular, you think about what climate investments looked like then. Primarily, they were clean energy. Primarily, they were energy efficiency, maybe some, innovative technologies. And those investments, circa 2003, 2004, 2005, were not cost competitive with business as usual on the energy side. So if you're sitting with IFC's hat on and you're saying, well, we would love to support a concentrated solar power project in South Africa, but the technology risk is pretty high for us. It's new. It's never been done before. The developer, is trying this out for the first time. This is very big. They would see the use of the additional source of climate finance as beneficial for them. And here I'm saying IFC to close the risk gap, all other things being equal. And so in the early days, blended finance in IFC was 100% climate oriented. And that's because, yes, that's because the climate finance dollars that were being allocated over and above ODA were coming through the development finance system for things like clean tech and renewables and energy efficiency, things like that. It evolved over time to other impact areas. But if you look back at what was being called blended finance from, call it 1998 to 2008, and what was being called climate finance, if you put those things kind of overlapping, 100% of it was climate oriented.
Well, I
So,
think just
yeah.
interject. I think that's quite fascinating because I don't think a history that people are aware of, right? I think they're looking at blended finance more as just a general push to get more private capital into development finance writ large, not aware that the initial push was for addressing climate change.
Again, very
Yeah,
much an energy investment for investments that weren't able to pencil out, but for which the private sector had innovation, maybe first mover advantages in a lot of places. We're going to enable projects to happen faster than they might otherwise happen. The example of the concentrated solar power project in South Africa, for example, the government would never have been able to pull that off in the same time frame.
yeah,
So, in the early days, really having a blended finance unit within an institution like IFC, the private sector arm of the World Bank, was really to enable IFC to go beyond what it could otherwise do. Now, what's happened over time has made your question a little bit more interesting because, costs have come down for a lot of technologies. At least on paper, many of them are cost competitive, which is different from being profitable, which is
Right.
very important.
We had the
Um,
podcast. We had Brett Christophers, who wrote a book on problem with renewables. Is they're super cheap, but as a producer, if you want a return on equity, you're not going to make a return on equity, and this is why I think there's the case for renewables to be big dinosaur-like public utilities where you're not looking at equity returns. You're looking at providing stable power over a 30 or 40 years time that, you pay off your debt, whatever, but it's not about making money.
well, the other thing that's happened, and that may be a different podcast, but the other thing that's happened, because it's a very interesting
Yeah.
question to unpack. But the other thing that's happened is the time horizon for addressing climate change has gotten much, much smaller.
Mm-hmm.
What we thought we needed to do even in 2015 and the time frame we thought we had to do it is completely different in 2020. And so this might kind of open up the aperture here from what was, accelerating investment in clean energy faster than the markets were doing it in the global South in the 2005, 2008, 2010 timeframe into what is now like entire economies need to change, not just the energy transition, but we have now locked in. I mean, I think the latest numbers I'm seeing, but we'll see, is that this year, 2024, might surpass 1.6, right? And that's the Copernicus model. We're warming pretty fast. Our ability to kind of withstand that, not just from a human perspective, but from a physical real asset perspective, is going to be challenged much faster than I think we otherwise thought. And therefore, the value of the public dollars to catalyze investments fast is pretty important. And the need to do that with an all of the above approach is also pretty important. And I think that might go into some of your comments about, isn't blended finance just capturing kind of things for the private sector that might or ought to be more in the public realm. My own view is it's all of the above fast,
Yeah.
right? And we can look at the kind of use of public dollars across a spectrum and allocate them around things that are have the potential to be more commercially viable or private sector led versus those that aren't and absolutely need public balance sheet support. And that exercise absolutely should be happening, but it can't be that it's one versus the other because we won't get it done.
No. But I think there's also something to be said about, often we hear that, oh, we've not done anything, we've not been trying, but actually we've been trying for a long time. Even though it's gotten warmer, we've actually made quite a bit of progress, right? So there's a lot of development happening in the global South towards shifting away from fossil fuels. There's a lot happening in rich countries as well. I mean, we need to recognize that, carbon emissions are going down in the OECD countries. China is still going, but it will likely go down. India is another that's going up, which is a problematic, but the pace of technological change is such that I feel I'm a bit bullish to say, well, we're not going back. And why would you not build wind turbines and solar panels and, nuclear is, I think, an important part of the mix. That's probably another conversation. But, just to say that we have been doing things and there has been efforts made in addressing climate change. It might not have been fast enough and big enough, but to say that we've, when Greta Thunberg said a couple of years ago, oh, it's just blah, blah, blah. And you think, wait a minute. Or even in this COP, right? The outcome, there was a lot of negativity. It's not enough money. It's not this. And it's like, yeah, it might not be, but to say that we're not doing enough, I think is wrong. Maybe I'm too optimistic, but I want to be optimistic.
I don't think that there's I don't think that there's a right or wrong perspective there. I think that the emphasis I would put on what you just said was that everybody needs to do their part. And the public dollars aren't sufficient. They must catalyze private investment. They must do their part to do that in a way that's the most efficient, right? My bee in my bonnet is when we use public dollars inefficiently, right? Which actually kind of, means we should be taking all the public dollars that we have, not just the climate finance ones, and making sure that they are, run through a screen of climate related risks, the economy to finance to et cetera, because that is the most efficient use of our public dollars domestically, internationally, global north, global south, given where we are on warming today. And the private investment community, commercial banks, private equity, infrastructure investors also should be doing their part to be identifying, assessing, quantifying climate related financial risks for their dollars. Because when you pull that together, you're using your blended dollars or your concessional dollars, you're blending them more efficiently. If your A is not doing that, but your B is doing that, your C is still inefficient. Is
Okay.
that, yeah? Because both
Here,
A and B need to think about climate related financial risks now in a completely different way than we did in 2005, 2008, or 2010. Back then, it was about proactively accelerating investment in something that had a pretty important public good. Now we have that plus managing risk and
right,
downside risk.
right. So I tried to, be positive. You've been in blended finance for a long time. You've been a pioneer in it. You know climate finance backwards and forwards, up and down. Is it working or not?
Right. So we started with kind of what's the definition, and we kind of still haven't finished a little bit because we can come to the COP discussions. The COP discussions did get as the definition started to get a little blurry. 2008, 2010, 2012. By 2015, we really had a successful Paris Agreement with a couple of footnotes that not very many people paid attention to, which drove uh, drove this circumstance where some people thought $100 billion a year was public capital, and other people absolutely intended that $100 billion a year to include the capital that public capital mobilized, right? I think we're still there a little bit. It's becoming closer. But what this year's COP outcome, I think, still needs to work through is whether the 300 billion is all public and all grants. So now we also have this issue of debt sustainability and whether climate finance can be in the form of loans, whether that's fair in the context of accelerating warming. I like to put that number in the context of the $1.3 trillion number, which is the need. And then I look to put that number in the context of the entire financial system. So if you go back to what I said a couple of minutes ago, it's not just that the public dollars, whether it's this much or this much, are, being deployed efficiently in their price or their concessionality or their benefit, but also that the rest of the system is also thinking about not just the opportunity side, but the risk side. And I think if you do that, you bring this pie together as puzzle pieces in a much more cohesive way. And we might have a chance of actually funding and financing the changes we need. A lot of people still want to kind of constrain the definition of climate finance to just the public dollars.
I saw the outcome of COP. I thought, well, because the criticisms of it, they look at they just say this is not enough money to address climate change, and this is not what we need. And you have to sit back and say, well, hey, there's what governments are doing, and that's all fine. Maybe it's not enough. It's something, but look at what's happening over here. And if you look at the investment community, commercial banks, corporates, there's a lot of money and a lot of people managing money or making decisions about where money's going to go, corporate sector or investment management, that are thinking, oh, I have to think about climate change as a risk. When we can talk about all the different risks that come with it, but also as an opportunity, because even though you might not make an equity return on building out renewables, there's still a lot of opportunities in making money off of the energy transition, or off of the sustainability transition, as we want to call it. And I think everyone's on to that. Not everyone. There's still some deniers out there. But I think, like you said, if we put the whole $100 trillion or whatever the size of markets are, and we get even 20% of that really focused, that's a lot of money. And that's actually probably enough, right? I mean, we tend to think that also, and I'm curious what you think about this. I mean, my view a lot is that, yes, we need some transformational investments, but in economies, we make investments all the time. We invest to keep up with, we need to invest in infrastructure because it wears out. We want better technology because it's nicer, right? Not because we have to, but because we want it. And this happens naturally. And so that shift will happen where, yes, there's a cost to it, but a lot of that will be spending anyways, right? Where's that additional investment when a lot of it's, well, buy a car in 10 years time. If it happens to be an electric car, well, you probably don't really care, right? But you're going to make that investment in a car in 10 years time anyways. And if
At some point. Yeah, well, this goes back to one of the drivers of why, the blended finance sort of idea in the 2000s kind of was started, which is that it should catalyze investment faster than the market or human behavior would otherwise allow it to happen, or would otherwise see it being realized. So, I mean, it's that speed part that's meant to be part of the characteristic of the approach, using climate finance to catalyze private investment. And I absolutely agree with you. If we had, but first of all, I agree with you that investors are moving. I think investors are pretty clearly understanding that climate risk can have some downsides. And I think some of the drivers of that awareness is, the increased intensity around storms, the physical risks that we're starting to see, right? And it's not just, impacts from those acute events, but also things that are chronic, degradation of returns because water scarcity is impacting manufacturing of blah, 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 right? I mean, there are things that are emerging because the planet's, the planet's physics are changing, that I think some investors, certainly corporates and industry, are starting to understand, and that some investors are starting to understand. So awareness is high about climate risk from a physical perspective. Understanding about what to do about that awareness is maybe half as high. And then the investors who understand, okay, the strategic implications on how to invest is maybe half of that, which is not your $20 trillion, but it could be. And that could be very important. While at the same time, we're also not doing what we need to do to mitigate emissions, to reduce emissions globally. And, the need to kind of, find the solutions to replace that, I think is as high as it's ever been, notwithstanding the fact that these businesses are penciling out from a cost perspective, notwithstanding the fact that there's, a lot more investment that's been going into renewables, and that they are accelerating around the world. It's not fast enough for the warming that's happening. And, I don't know how much more time we have. Because again, investing, either the public balance sheet or the private investment, all happens over a time horizon. And it used to be that we thought we had till 2050, and I'm not entirely sure that we still have that much time. If we're really locking in 1/6 this year, we had 1/6 this year, and it's locking in what it locks in. We could see 2 degrees in the 2030s, which would be, 15 years hot and 15 years ahead of time. Right. So we really, really need to figure out how to kind of accelerate that energy transition faster.
Yeah.
Faster. And that might be that the private sector hasn't been fast enough, and we have to, you alluded to this, we have to go back to kind of more of a public industrial revolution type of thing. But governments are around the world are kind of locked.
Yeah.
They are moving much slower than even they did 50 years ago, right? So, I don't know if that's the solution either.
Well, it was mainly only on like public utilities, right? So it's more the let's not allow wait for the market to do it because the market doesn't see the risk return profile. It's more the long term patient ownership that I think is important. But the one thing I'd like to ask you about is, I mean, you sort of mentioned this, is that there's a focus. What's the risk that all those climate dollars just go to climate finance dollars and interest, an awareness of risk goes just to the adaptation, right? You know, at the expense of mitigation. Because you can make the argument that, well, a lot of climate change is baked in. Fossil fuels are a really great source of energy and heat and all these things and industrial processes. And we're better off just adapting to climate change rather than actually mitigating it. How is that? How do we prevent that argument from kind of taking over? Because like you're basically saying, well, we need to leave a lot of it in the ground, or what we do burn, we need to sequester the carbon somehow. We need to, properly actually mitigate it. But because you can imagine a lot of the tension being put on the adaptation side. It's like, well, okay, I'm an insurer, and I think, well, I'm not going to insure homes in Florida because, well, they have hurricanes to begin with, but there's a lot more hurricanes, and just not going to do that.
Yeah.
So how do we ensure that then mitigation is actually where the climate finance dollars are going to?
Yeah. So I'll take a step back and take us back to kind of what are these dollars in their origin anyway? They are from the public balance sheet, right? It's ODA. Climate finance is additional to ODA, but it's development dollars that come from an appropriation or an allocation from a government to be given into the system. And those dollars also need to be allocated pretty efficiently, right? You wouldn't want those dollars to go to something that does have the potential to have private investment, or you would want fewer of those dollars to maximize more of the private investment, right? So you put that on a spectrum, and when you look at that spectrum vis-a-vis different types of investments that help with the mitigation agenda and different types of investments that help with the adaptation agenda, you can start to pull out things that are more appropriate for crowding in private capital. And I don't think it's a mitigation versus adaptation alone question. I think this sits in a context of a whole bunch of other things. If you're sitting in an emerging market where you don't have competitive energy, you have, for lack of a better word, mostly state provided energy, and you need to kind of leapfrog over fossil expansion in order to kind of make your energy production cleaner, you probably might think that you're going to do that leapfrogging with the public balance sheet more than private investment, right? Conversely, in adaptation, a lot of people talk about nature-based solutions, which don't really often have revenue streams that can attract private capital in any circumstance. And nature-based solutions for many emerging markets are also part of the assets of the public side. So you would want dollars to go into supporting nature-based reinforcement conservation plans in country X from the public side, right? Which means you then have a balance of things that can be, again, have the potential to be commercially viable, have the potential to crowd in, private capital. I'll take you talked about buying a car in 10 years that's electric. You could electrify tuk-tuks in India right now and have a pretty good business model. And that transportation is a huge source of emissions, right? In a place like India. And that business will take off like wildfire, right? And that business probably doesn't need many concessional dollars to really get going, for example. So there's different ways to think about this. And you think about it both in the context of a country, but sector by sector, how the services are provided by the sector, also what the context of the private investment is already doing there, and then thinking about how your dollars are allocated. I don't think so. First of all, I do think that infrastructure has to be made resilient in places that are going to see that are highly vulnerable, that are highly exposed, and where we already know that temperature rise is going to bring about a lot of more extreme events, maybe more frequently, right? I think if you've got critical infrastructure that's exposed to that, and you know in the next 10 years, you've got to reinforce that, it's a good use of dollars to do it in a resilient way to the hazards you're going to experience. I also think because of where we haven't got in terms of the entire energy transition, I also think that using some of this capital to further accelerate what's happening in some of these countries is a good use of dollars. Country by country, whether that nets out to less than the fewer dollars than you actually have, I'm willing to accept that that's probably the case in a lot of places. And then you have a discussion about what else can be done. But this goes back to what I said earlier, which is it can't be that A does its job on identifying, assessing, and quantifying climate related financial risk, but B doesn't if you're going to kind of use a blended finance approach for climate change.
So, final question. Maybe this is too big of a question. What does blended finance or the blended finance community get wrong? And what do they need to get right to accelerate capital flows to address climate change?
What do they get wrong today?
Yeah.
That's a great question. I think that the blended finance community today is far more sophisticated than it was 15 years ago. But I still think they need to pay attention. Those of us who do it need to pay attention to a few things. One, for me, top of the list is being efficient with your dollars, right? The second is understanding that applying a blended finance approach, concessional capital, and a blended finance approach is different if you're providing debt versus guarantees versus equity and grants. Oftentimes we don't use grants enough when we should be, and we haven't done enough on the patient equity side. There's a big discussion from the last couple of years around debt sustainability for emerging markets, and it's not just because of climate change, but that's big headwinds to deploying blended finance. And we might just need more grant components of climate finance in order to help address some of that.
Just for listeners, that means free money. It's not market. It's just giving the money to build something, to do something in a particular direction.
But yes, and the point of what you just said is to do something in a particular direction, right? Because you wouldn't want grant capital to go in and those outcomes not to be there. Right. There's a lot of discussion about debt for nature swaps. There's some discussion at the IMF about, in the context of debt sustainability and climate, about, freeing up capital and headroom of countries that can enable them to invest in certain things. Barbados just had a fantastic example of this in the last couple of weeks, where, they freed up part of their debt burden, used savings to invest in a water infrastructure that's going to be resilient. It does a couple of other things as well. But thinking about those ways capital can be allocated, that's in addition to the financing that's being made, I think is going to be pretty helpful at the macro level for a lot of emerging markets. You could also make the argument that in many parts of the developed world, certainly in Europe and here in the United States, that there are communities that mirror the same type of need, depending on where they're located and what they're facing and what kind of infrastructure they're lacking. So I don't want this to come across as only a kind of a comment related to kind of emerging markets and development in the global South. Actually, climate change is creating these circumstances and economic kind of inequality in some places where those types of ideas might be relevant.
So I said that was the final question, but I'm going to ask you one more question. Are you optimistic or are you pessimistic on, I won't say just climate change, but on the ability of the financial sector in the main to actually do something?
I'm cautiously optimistic. Um, However, well, I'll say why I'm cautiously optimistic. I'm cautiously optimistic because I do think investors of various types, right? And investors aren't one thing either. Banks are different from private equity, are different from pension funds, and institutional investors are different from the development finance world. But there is sufficient awareness and growing understanding of what climate change does to financial returns, that I am cautiously optimistic that once this begins to be baked into the DNA of how those investors make their investments, whether they're $100 million investments or $100,000 investments, that they're thinking the right ways about climate as a driver for opportunities and as a risk, potentially over the time horizons of their investments, that behavioral change in those organizations might start to accelerate. I think it's started in a number of places. There's some political noise around some of it, but nonetheless, climate change is here. The world's warming. This is not political. People understand that. Um, Cautiously optimistic because it hasn't happened fast enough to date, notwithstanding the evidence base, notwithstanding the not just the practice of blending different types of capital, but also the awareness around climate as a financial risk. We're close to 10 years in on that. Mark Carney's speech was just about 10 years ago. So, people understand this. They understand it as an issue spotting exercise. I'm cautiously optimistic that it will start to make its way into the practice of investing much faster. But cautiously optimistic because I also think we don't have as much time as we thought we did. So that behavioral change about how investment happens has to happen faster. And the public dollars, need to be used more efficiently.
So we're moving in the right direction. We just need to start running.
Running, sprinting, all of the above. I do think, you mentioned nuclear earlier in our conversation. 20 years ago, there were a lot of people who were anti-nuclear, and I think that community is much smaller now, given where we are
Yeah.
in emissions.
Yeah. I agree. On that note, Stacy Swann, thank you for joining me. You have been listening to the New Enlightenment podcast from Adam Smith's Panmure House. If you found this interesting, please consider subscribing and sharing. If you would like to learn more about Panmure House, please go to our website, panmurehouse.org. Thanks for listening, and until next time.